The year was 1559, and the air was thick with tension as the newly elected members of the House of Commons gathered for their first session under Queen Elizabeth I. The room was a buzz of whispers and nervous glances, a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings of the Palace of Westminster. Among the MP, a sense of unease was palpable. They were about to take on a daunting task, to navigate the complex and often treacherous waters of politics in a time when the Crown's power was absolute, and the fate of the nation hung in the balance. As the Speaker stepped forward, the room fell silent. He began to petition the Lord Keeper, a high-ranking official representing the Queen, for the customary liberties and privileges that the House of Commons had long enjoyed. These privileges were crucial. They were the only real tools the Commons had to assert their influence and protect their members from the overwhelming power of the monarchy. The Speaker's voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "My Lord, we humbly request that the customary liberties and privileges of the House of Commons be recognized and upheld. We need the freedom to speak our minds, to debate without fear, and to ensure that the laws we pass serve the best interests of our people." The Lord Keeper, a man of stern demeanor and unyielding authority, listened intently. When the Speaker finished, he took a deep breath and began his response. His words were carefully chosen, but the weight of his authority was clear. "My good MP, the Queen is well aware of the importance of the customary liberties and privileges of the House of Commons. However, you must understand that these liberties come with a great responsibility. The Queen's realm must be governed with wisdom and prudence, and the laws you propose must reflect Her Majesty's will and the best interests of the nation." He paused, letting his words sink in. The Crown's prerogative is a sacred trust, a power that ensures the stability and security of the realm. The Queen must have the final say in all matters of state, and the Commons must respect this authority. Your role is to advise and assist, not to challenge or undermine. The room was silent, the tension almost unbearable. The MP knew that the balance of power in this new Parliament would be delicate. They were not merely pawns in the Queen's game. They were the voice of the people, and their words and actions would shape the future of England. The Lord Keeper continued, "You have been chosen to represent your constituents, and the Queen expects you to do so with integrity and loyalty. The privileges you seek are not a license to act recklessly or to pursue your own interests. They are a means to an end, a tool to help you serve the common good." He glanced around the room, his gaze firm. "Remember, the Queen is not your adversary. She is your partner in governance. Work with her, not against her, and you will find that your efforts are not in vain. The needs of the realm are many, and the challenges we face are great. Let us move forward together with a shared purpose and a commitment to the welfare of our nation." The MP nodded, some more reluctantly than others. They understood the gravity of the Lord Keeper's words, and the delicate balance they would have to maintain. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but they were determined to fulfill their duty, to speak for the people, and to shape the future of England with courage and wisdom. As the session began, the MP took their seats, ready to begin the work that would define their place in history. The air was still tense, but there was a sense of resolve. They knew that the path they chose would have lasting consequences, not just for themselves, but for the entire nation. The eyes of the people were on them, and the weight of their responsibility was heavy, but they were ready. They had to be. The fate of the realm was in their hands. In the early 1500s, the Church in England was a big and powerful institution. It had its own set of rules, called canon law, which covered many aspects of life, from marriage and divorce to the handling of wills. The Church was also divided into two main regions, Canterbury and York, each led by an archbishop. Within these regions there were many smaller areas, called dioceses, each overseen by a bishop. The Church's power came from its close connection to the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, who was based in Rome. The Pope appointed important church leaders, and sometimes sent representatives to England to make decisions. This meant that the English king didn't have complete control over the Church, which could lead to conflicts. One of the biggest sources of tension was the issue of who got to appoint bishops and other important church officials. The king wanted to choose these people himself, but the Pope often had a say. Additionally, the Church had its own courts and laws, which sometimes clashed with the king's courts and laws. For example, the Church could offer sanctuary, a place of safety, to people who were in trouble with the law. This made it hard for the king to enforce his laws. During Henry VII's reign, the first Tudor king, he tried to increase his control over the church. He appointed bishops who were loyal to him and who had skills in law and administration rather than just religious knowledge. This helped him ensure that the church would support his policies. Henry also used laws like the Statutes of Praemunire to limit the church's ability to refer legal cases to Rome, which helped strengthen his authority. Henry VII's efforts to control the church laid the groundwork for what his son, Henry VIII, would do later. Henry VIII wanted to break away from the Pope's authority completely, especially when the Pope refused to let him divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Henry used the power of the English Parliament to pass laws that gave him control over the church. The Act in Restraint of Appeals made it illegal to appeal to Rome in legal matters, and the Act of Supremacy declared the king as the supreme head of the Church of England. This shift was a major change in the relationship between the church and the state. Instead of being a separate entity with its own laws and leadership, the church became an extension of the king's authority. Henry and his advisors, like Thomas Cromwell, used this new power to close down monasteries and take control of church lands and wealth. During the reigns of Henry's children, Edward VI and Mary, the church went through more changes. Edward favored Protestant ideas, while Mary tried to restore Catholicism. However, when Elizabeth I came to the throne, she tried to find a middle ground. She kept the Church of England separate from Rome, but allowed some Protestant practices. Elizabeth also took her role as the supreme governor of the church very seriously, using her authority to enforce religious policies and maintain control over the church. Despite Elizabeth's efforts, the church faced challenges from both conservative and radical groups. Some people wanted to return to the old Catholic ways, while others wanted a more radical Protestant church. Elizabeth's compromise, known as the Elizabethan religious settlement, aimed to create a church that could satisfy most of her subjects, but it wasn't always successful. Many people still found ways to practice their preferred form of religion, sometimes in secret. The story of the English church during the Tudor era is one of power struggles, religious changes, and attempts to find a balance between the old and the new. From Henry VII's early efforts to increase royal control to Elizabeth's attempts to create a stable and unified church, the relationship between the crown and the church was a central issue in Tudor politics. The early years of the Tudor dynasty, starting with Henry VII, saw a delicate balance between the power of the church and the state. Historians like Christopher Haig argue that the treatment of the church during this time wasn't particularly remarkable unless viewed through the lens of the later Reformation. They see Henry VII's reign as a period of subtle compromise between the church and the crown. During Henry VII's rule, the church's authority was respected, but the king maintained control over certain key areas. For example, laws of sanctuary which protected people from arrest were upheld, but those accused of treason could still be pursued. Similarly, the benefit of clergy, which allowed clergymen to avoid secular courts, was modified to ensure only genuine clergymen could claim this protection. Papal authority was generally acknowledged, and the church paid a moderate amount in taxes to Rome. Wieland estimated that the English church paid about £4,800 per year to the papacy, compared to £12,000 to the crown. In return, the papacy granted Henry VII several political favors, such as a dispensation to marry Elizabeth of York and legitimize their children. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Morton, was appointed with papal approval and later made a cardinal. The selection of bishops was also left to the crown, further strengthening the king's control over the church. When Henry VIII ascended the throne, this cooperation continued, especially through the influence of Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey, as the king's chief minister, held significant power over the church. Historians like Peter Gwynne argue that Wolsey's authority came from his close relationship with Henry VIII, not just his legatine powers. This power was granted by the papacy to support the king, who was seen as a valuable ally against political threats. Wolsey's court, the most powerful church court in the land, was thus under the king's control. The Henrician Reformation didn't happen because of a growing conflict between the king and the papacy. Instead, it occurred because a system that had worked well suddenly broke down. When Henry VIII sought to divorce Catherine of Aragon, the papacy, influenced by political pressures in Italy, could not grant the annulment. This rejection led to the break with Rome, and the establishment of the Church of England under the king's control. When Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558, she faced the challenge of enforcing a new religious settlement in a country that had recently embraced Mary I's Catholic restoration. The settlement of 1559–63 aimed to create a broadly Protestant Church of England, but enforcing this was not easy. Historians like Christopher Haig describe the settlement as another in a succession of political reformations, noting that the Church of England was not immediately transformed into a Protestant institution. The laws passed in the early years of Elizabeth's reign made Protestant practices possible, but they did not immediately change the beliefs and practices of the people. The physical removal of Catholic images and symbols was relatively straightforward, as the government's enforcement mechanisms were effective. However, changing deeply held beliefs and practices was much harder. Christopher Haig's research shows that Catholic resistance went through two phases. The first phase, survivalism, involved a conservative attachment to pre-Reformation practices, which gradually faded. The second phase, starting in the 1580s, saw the emergence of a more organized and ideologically grounded Catholic resistance, influenced by missionary priests from Europe. Local resistance to the new religious laws was significant. In many areas, the government lacked the resources to enforce its policies effectively. D.M. Palliser points out that large dioceses and the reliance on unpaid local officials made it difficult to implement the settlement. In some regions, the government's approach was cautious to avoid stirring up local tensions. For example, Bishop Curtis of Chichester was disciplined for taking a strong stance against conservative elements. The revolt of the Northern Earls in 1569 and the Pope's excommunication of Elizabeth in 1570 marked a turning point. The government began to use its machinery more vigorously to enforce the settlement. Bishops were ordered to conduct visitations, and special measures were taken in areas of strong resistance. Despite these efforts, Catholic resistance persisted, but over time, the government's consistent policies led to the gradual establishment of a Protestant Church of England. By the 1580s, Protestantism had gained a foothold in positions of power, including the Privy Council, Parliament, and local governments. Elizabeth also faced challenges from more radical Protestants, known as Puritans. These individuals sought to reform the Church according to the principles of the continental Reformed churches. Elizabeth, who valued her authority as supreme governor, was wary of the independent thinking of the Puritans. This tension came to a head in 1576–77 when Archbishop Grindal refused to suppress prophesyings, meetings where the scriptures were discussed. His defiance led to his suspension, and Elizabeth became more cautious about appointing bishops who might challenge her authority. Overall, Elizabeth's government had to navigate a complex landscape of religious beliefs and local resistance to effectively enforce the religious settlement. The long-term success of the settlement was a result of persistence and the gradual shift in the religious landscape over the course of her reign. In the heart of Westminster, the Queen reigned as the head of the Church, but in the far corners of the realm, things were not so simple. The nobility and gentry, along with certain town corporations, believed they had a right to influence the Church. They saw themselves as part of the governing elite, and took it upon themselves to shape the local church, often going ahead with their own reforms without much regard for the Queen's wishes. Historians like Rosemary O'Day and Patrick Collinson have pointed out that the Queen's authority was often challenged by some of her own leading courtiers. Men like the Earl of Leicester, the Earl of Bedford, and the Earl of Pembroke had their own ideas about religion. They sympathized with moderate Puritans and had enough influence to appoint church officials who sometimes frustrated the conservative plans of Archbishop Whitgift. This situation improved somewhat in the later years of Elizabeth's reign, as many of these influential nobles passed away, but it left a lasting impact, making the church more conservative in the long run. Archbishop Grindal, who led the church earlier in Elizabeth's reign, tried to guide his clergy like a gentle shepherd. However, his successor, Archbishop Whitgift, took a different approach. Whitgift treated his clergy more like students who needed to be disciplined. This often led to resentment among the clergy, who felt that the bishops were becoming too harsh and authoritarian. This resentment only grew stronger and fueled a growing dislike of the entire episcopal system. Despite the changes at the royal court, the problems in the localities remained. Both Puritans and Catholics continued to resist the religious settlement imposed by Elizabeth and Whitgift. Historians generally agree that Elizabeth won the political battle over the religious settlement, successfully fending off attempts by both religious extremes to change it. However, outside the center of government, the story was different. People in the local communities, driven by their strong religious beliefs, turned their homes into centers of worship, ignoring the parish system. The government found it difficult to enforce uniformity in these areas, as the zealots, whether Catholic or Protestant, were determined to follow their own path. In the end, the state's efforts to enforce religious uniformity were often met with resistance, showing that Elizabeth's royal supremacy over the church was more theoretical than practical. The local nobility, gentry, and religious zealots played significant roles in shaping the religious landscape of England, often acting independently of the Queen's wishes. As we wrap up our journey through the financial world of the Tudor monarchy, we see a tale of two ministers, Cardinal Wolsey and Thomas Cromwell, each facing the daunting task of keeping the royal coffers full during the reign of Henry VIII. Henry, known for his grand ambitions and expensive wars, relied heavily on his advisors to find the money to fuel his dream. Wolsey, a man of great ambition and intelligence, found ways to squeeze every possible penny from the realm. He made clever use of traditional methods like the subsidy, a form of taxation that, unlike older forms, was more efficient and fair. Wolsey also cut back on unnecessary spending, canceling grants and reforming the royal household. His efforts brought in massive amounts of money, especially through the Parliament of 1523, which was a huge success for the crown. However, his methods also had their limits. When he tried to impose the amicable grant in 1525 to fund another war, the people rebelled, showing that even the most skilled financier has his limits. Cromwell, who took over after Wolsey's fall, understood that the old methods were not enough. He needed new, bold solutions. Cromwell's big idea was to tap into the wealth of the church, which was vast and largely untouched. His plans started with small steps, like bringing legal pressure on the church, but eventually led to the dramatic dissolution of the monasteries. This not only solved the immediate financial crisis, but also reshaped the English landscape, redistributing wealth and power in ways that would have long-lasting effects. Both Wolsey and Cromwell were brilliant in their own ways, but they faced different challenges. Wolsey worked in a time when the traditional methods, though stretched to their limits, could still be made to work. Cromwell, on the other hand, had to think outside the box and find new sources of income. Their efforts show that the financial health of the Tudor monarchy was not just a matter of clever accounting, but also of adapting to changing circumstances and taking bold actions when necessary. In the end, the financial policies of these two men laid the groundwork for the future of the English crown. They showed that a strong, well-managed treasury was essential for the success of any monarch, and that sometimes the most challenging problems require the most innovative solutions. The legacy of Wolsey and Cromwell lives on, reminding us that the story of the Tudors is not just about kings and queens, but also about the people behind the scenes who kept the kingdom running, one penny at a time.